All right, welcome back, everyone. During this pandemic and really during what is considered Holy Week for many Catholics around there is still that debate out there in regards to separation of church and state. And to talk about this a little bit more with us, we're joined by Jeremy Dice, an attorney with First Liberty Institute, an organization that is indeed focused on providing and protecting Americans' ability to practice whatever religion they want to out there. Jeremy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Right away, I got to go to the First Amendment. You know, you almost want to say that this is kind of a no-brainer here. If I want to go to church on Good Friday, even during a pandemic, and let's say it's less than 10 people, why can I not go?
Well, look, I affirm that feeling, and I think we all have appreciated perhaps more than ever. Maybe we've forgotten a little bit how appreciative we ought to be for that First Amendment, that right not only to freely exercise our faith, but that little clause that follows, it says we bear the right to also peaceably assemble as a people here. And those both come into play as we discuss this issue. And we've suggested three things. In fact, we put this out on our website at firstliberty.org. Number one, we want our churches to continue to serve their communities. Frankly, the government's going to need the care, the comfort, and the calm that they provide to the community during the midst of this pandemic. But the second thing we've said is that temporary restrictions on large gatherings are probably going to be okay. Now, I say probably because there are two key aspects of that. Number one, they have to be temporary restrictions. They have to be temporarily tailored to meet a compelling justification. And I think every court in the nation will agree that a worldwide pandemic is just such a compelling justification. But even as they're applying those restrictions, they cannot do so in a way that is discriminatory. In other words, you can't say that movie theaters can be opened up, but churches cannot. That would be discrimination because, I mean, clearly germs follow in both locations. And so temporary restrictions are probably going to be okay. Third thing that we've said is that anything permanent, any permanent restriction on the right to freely exercise one's faith or peaceably to assemble, that's never going to fly. And we'd be happy to challenge that wherever that may arise.
So there is that one argument that secular businesses are being allowed to operate, but churches are not. Would that argument, I guess, hold up in a courtroom?
Well, I'll answer the same way that my law professors used to answer me with hard questions, and that was, it depends. It really does depend upon the particular statute. For instance, here in McKinney, Texas, not very far from where I'm sitting, the city there banned all religious services entirely. And so if you had a certain amount of employees, over 10, or you'd be dispermitted to meet if you were a church. Now, interestingly, they left restaurants unaffected by that. So for instance, if McDonald's wanted to hand out burgers through the drive-through with 45 different employees in the store, they could have done so. But if a church had to meet at their location to develop a live stream of their service with 11 individuals or even 12, they couldn't have done that. And so we sent them a quick letter to point out the discrepancy, and thankfully they changed it real quick. Now, it's hard to keep track of all those ordinances across the country. There's probably 40,000 different municipalities in the country. But by and large, I think we've been seeing a fairly decent balance of not only municipalities trying to provide as much freedom as possible during this time of crisis, but also I think it's important to point out, I think most houses of worship have also been voluntarily wanting to sequester during this time to make sure that their people are protected and providing that calm and comfort that is so necessary during this time of the coronavirus.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think the majority out there across the country are indeed doing that and streaming their services, and people are watching from the confines of their own home. When it comes to the one pastor, Rodney Browne, out in Florida, what was your reaction when that pastor was arrested?
Look, I think everybody has been trying to do their best in the midst of a difficult situation. Many of these churches have never known anything but meeting together. And I think it's very difficult to figure out what was actually going on in that particular situation. Look, Americans can put up with a lot. We can tolerate a lot of things, even temporary restrictions on our religious freedom. And as we try to figure this all out, mistakes are going to be made. I think government will overreach at times, and it's our responsibility to remind them of that overreach and to remind them to get back to what they're supposed to be doing as they provide the governmental services that are so necessary right now. But at the same time, it's important for us as individuals to love one another's neighbor. Americans will put up with temporary restrictions on their faith if it means caring for one another in this sort of way. But they're not going to do it forever. And so I think it's important that the state recognize how vital the churches are, these houses of worship are around the country, and caring for the community locally there, and frankly, reducing the burden overall on the government itself. And so whether it's down in Tampa or comments like Mayor de Blasio had in New York City, those kinds of careless comments or threats of intimidation towards churches probably are not very helpful.
Let me stop you there. I'll stop you there because just to clarify, the comments was basically shutting down places of worship, right?
Yeah, Mayor de Blasio in New York City actually threatened to permanently shut down houses of worship that would not comply with their public health ordinance. Well, and I think particularly in that case, it was synagogues. I want to chalk it up to Mayor de Blasio just being under a very difficult situation and speaking rather inartfully, although I'll point out I don't think he's actually walked any of that back yet, which is unfortunate. Nonetheless, it's important for us to remember that Americans are not going to tolerate a permanent shutdown of any house of worship, even in the midst of a public health crisis. Look, I think there's an important lesson for us to learn from history here as well. Back in 1918, when the Spanish flu was invading the country here, churches were understandably worried about these public health orders, the same ones we're under today. But thankfully, the pastors got together. They debated this as whether or not they should follow that or not. And in Washington, D.C., for instance, the pastors actually passed a resolution stating that they wanted to cheerfully go on record cheerfully as complying with these public health records, and urged their congregations to abide by them for the time that was necessary, so that they would actually not only be safe but use the time to pray for those who were ill. I think this is the time for us to do the very same thing.
There you go. Jeremy, let me just a clarification on my end here. I mean, when it comes to the federal government and the state government, is it up to the states to really determine if religious gatherings are deemed essential?
Yeah, well, there's a bit of coordination that has to go in on all those things, but what we're seeing right now is our Federalist system on display, where the best power is held locally, and that freedom is ensured locally as well. So yes, in large part, it's either governors or municipalities that are making those directions. Let's not forget that 10th Amendment, that all the rights not expressly ordained within the Constitution are reserved to the states, and if not that, to the people themselves. We're seeing that on stark display here right now, even in the midst of this coronavirus challenge.
So for First Liberty Institute, you guys support what some of these localities are doing in regards to temporary, and the word temporary is important there, of closing down the churches and streaming the services, or do you feel like there is the right for people who, no matter what religion you are, who want to practice, do they have the right to actually go inside a synagogue, inside a church, if it's less than 10 people, and have a service?
Temporarily, even applied restrictions are going to be held up in court for now. I don't know how long that temporary extends for into the future here, but I think we're certainly within the period of time when that's okay. You know, in terms of pastors, churches, synagogue leaders, whomever they may be that are thinking about defying these orders right now, look, I think right now is a time for prudence, not defiance. That time may come later as we get into this crisis even further, if we have to get in that further. But right now it's time for us to be prudent and act in a prudent way, and not to defy our governmental leaders. Let's not forget that our government has been instituted by God for our good. And because of that, I think it's important for us to be able to trust the health apparatus that the state brings to bear on situations like this. But at the same time, let's be quick to remind the government too of the important role that the church, our houses of worship throughout this country, provide within their communities as well. They should not discount that during this time, and they ought to rely upon that comfort and calm that these churches and houses of worship can provide in the midst of a difficult situation.
Is there a story, not now, but maybe down the road? I was talking to a pastor the other day, and he said that his parish specifically was taking a financial hit, right? So people of the congregation just weren't coming to Mass. They weren't dropping off the envelopes in the basket. Is that money that maybe churches could recoup later if this continues on for months down the road here?
You know, it's interesting to bring that up. The Congress, of course, passed the CARES Act a couple of weeks ago. And after President Trump signed that into effect, it was discovered that there was a program in the 1970s, an administrative rule that was instituted that would have prevented churches and parishes and other houses of worship, faith-based organizations, from participating in those forgivable loans contemplated by Congress. Thankfully, within just a matter of days, the administration was able to remove that restriction. And now if you go to the Small Business Administration's website, you'll read a bunch of frequently asked questions that ensure that guarantee churches the ability to participate in that program, to ensure that they can receive the relief that Congress intended to provide them during this time. Look, churches in particular, religious institutions and faith-based organizations more broadly, they provide a socioeconomic impact upwards, at least to some estimates, of over $1 trillion annually. And so if those ministries are going to go under, that economic cost is going to be assigned to the government and the taxpayers that fund it. So it's vital for these churches, these faith-based organizations, to remain above board or above water during this time. And whether that means, depending upon charitable giving, we certainly hope that continues. But it certainly does mean that they ought to be considered amongst their secular comparators that are able to provide or able to receive the relief that Congress intended under the CARES Act. We hope that they will, and thankfully the administration, the Trump administration, has recently ensured that they can.
We get a lot of questions from viewers, and sometimes we like to pass them along during these interviews. And I did get one regarding this topic from someone. I don't know if you can help us answer this one, but Easter Sunday, you can't go inside a church, but what if people got together outside the church and there was social distancing and this service was held outside, everyone's 6-10 feet apart? Would that be allowed? Would you be okay with that? Is that a possibility, Jeremy?
Theoretically, that could be possible. Of course, we'd want to look at the local ordinances and state executive orders that are on the books for those types of things. But as long as their secular counterparts are doing something similar, I'm sure something could be worked out. We've seen a lot of very creative means to be able to engage in community and continue worship services. Thank goodness we have things like Zoom and Skype and YouTube and Facebook right now that provide churches the ability to broadcast to their community during this time. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of churches engaged in very creative means. Some churches have gone to the old drive-in movie theater idea, where they'll turn their parking lot basically into a drive-in movie theater, and the pastor stands at the front preaching over a shortwave FM transmitter to his parishioners in their cars. I even saw a priest in Maryland, I think it was, who set up a chair in his parking lot and sat behind a curtain and put out cones to maintain a 6-foot distance, where he could hear confessions of his parishioners as they drove through the parking lot to maintain that. I even saw a story out of Alaska where there was a pastor up there who preached to his congregation of 35 people in sub-freezing weather, along with blowing winds, over a loudspeaker so that they could hear each other in the cars out there. The good news is that most Americans are complying with the requests of their government to maintain a social distance. And this has been a time of great creativity that I think we're going to look back on with a little bit of fondness, but also gratitude that we no longer have to maintain it.
Yeah, one more for you here, and this is kind of a legal question. I know the governor of Florida there, he issued a stay-at-home order describing religious services as essential, but then there was a second order he made that overrides any locality guidelines. When it comes to state versus localities, can the state override whatever guidelines certain cities or counties issue?
Yes, it can. The state certainly can do that. They've done that here in Texas as well. I don't think North Carolina has done that. I don't know about the other states, but sometimes that is important, as in this case, so that there's a uniform understanding throughout the entire state, rather than in the state of Texas, for instance, there are several hundred different counties here, all of which could have a different ordinance in place during this time. It's helpful for everybody to be on the same page and have kind of one guiding principle throughout the state. That's a matter left to the best judgment of state officials, working with county officials as well. And certainly, I think it's a difficult path to navigate here. And so let's continue to have our patience with our local officials, our elected officials down in whatever state capital you might find yourself here, as we all try to do our very best right now during a very difficult situation and season.
Yeah, very difficult situation indeed. It's a pandemic. It's Holy Week. Something I haven't lived through myself. So I think it's important to remind everyone we are in this together as one. Jeremy Dice with First Liberty Institute. Jeremy, I appreciate the conversation. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course.